All right, welcome everyone to the South Asia Institute's first talk of the semester, and we are delighted to have Barton Scott from the University of Toronto. Just a little bit about Bart. I have not met him, but I have read his work, so I can speak to this. His first book was quite brilliant, right? Spiritual Despots, which combined European political theory with Indian political thought, which was, and tracing its various genealogies, and the production of a notion of a self, right? So this is his ability to traverse multiple disciplinary registers is what makes his work quite good. And today he's going to be presenting on From Insult to Injury, the Indian Penal Code and the Governance of Religious Feelings, which is part of his most recent work, which is Slandering the Sacred, Law, Media, and Religious Affect in Colonial India. So let's all please welcome Bart.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everybody for coming out mid-afternoon, the second week of the term. It's a hectic time, so I appreciate people being here. I wanted to thank Gowrie, who sadly is not able to be with us today due to illness, but thanks to Bill as well for helping to set up the talk. So what I'm presenting today is work in progress as part of a book manuscript that's very much in the works. So the ideas here, I think most of the ideas in this paper are being presented in this room for the very first time. And so I look forward to the conversation to help me refine and reframe some of the thoughts that I'm working on here. So I will begin. The talk is From Insult to Injury. In 2012, no, come on, technology. There we go. In 2012, a case was filed against actor Shah Rukh Khan while he was in Bihar filming a song called Radha on the Dance Floor. In 2014, a scandal started to brew around scholar Wendy Doniger's book, The Hindus, An Alternative History. In 2016, politician Arvind Kejriwal was criticized for tweeting a cartoon of Narendra Modi sending Hanuman to burn down JNU. In 2017, the film Padmavat was said to have outraged the religious feelings of Rajputs. In 2018, political commentator Abhijit Iyer Mitra was arrested in Delhi for a tweet, for a tweet that said that the Konark Sun Temple in Orissa was, in light of its erotic sculptures, not a temple, but, quote, a humple. What do all these events have in common? Section 295A of the Indian Penal Code, a law that criminalizes, quote, deliberate and malicious acts intended to outrage religious feelings of any class by insulting its religions or religious beliefs. Since it was passed in 1927, this law has been invoked both legally and in popular discourse against a wide range of texts, from the Satanic Verses to the Da Vinci Code, from James Lane's Shivaji to Amir Khan's Piquet. Widely decried as inimical to free speech, the law has, if anything, become an even more visible part of Indian public culture in the 21st century than it had been in the 20th. Today, I'm going to try to tell the story of 295A, or at least one version of that story. Currently, I'm hard at work on a book manuscript entitled Slandering the Sacred, which offers a sort of cultural history of 295A, or at least a prehistory of it. My account ends with the passage of the law in 1927. I trace the Indian Penal Code's regulations on religion back to the 1830s, when they were first conceived by Thomas Macaulay. I take a deep dive into the culture of religious controversy that spread outward from the Arya Samaj, the religious group responsible for the Rangila Rasul, the tract that triggered the creation of 295A. And I work to put these intertwined religious and legal histories into conversation with recent scholarship coming out of several quarters. This includes work on critical secular studies by the likes of Saba Mahmood and Winifred Sullivan, work on colonial legal history from Bernard Cohn to Mitra Sharafi, and work on the genealogies of the modern category religion from Talal Asad to Tomoko Masuzawa and beyond. One of the questions that I'm pursuing is how religion, as an object of secular governance, came to be conceptually linked to feelings, to emotions, passions, and affects. 295A, I think, is an important chapter in this larger history of the legal governance of religion in secular modernity. Today I'm giving you one piece, a central piece, of this larger story. In researching the history of 295A, I became interested in a side story, a sort of B-plot, that has been thus far unexplored in the scholarship. There was a shadow law, a 297A, that was proposed in 1927 but never enacted. This failed law would have protected, quote, sacred personalities rather than religious feelings from injurious speech. If 295A was a sort of proto-hate speech law, the short-lived 297A was closer to libel law. It would have prohibited defamatory speech against sacred individuals. Let me state my argument in overly melodramatic terms. The lost law, 297A, is also the interpretive key for understanding the 1927 scandal that resulted in 295A. By juxtaposing these two laws, the law that is and the law that could have been, we get new and important insights into the inner workings of legal secularism. So here's what will happen over the next half hour or so. The talk should be like about 40 minutes total, allowing for plenty of time for conversation, I hope. First, I will summarize the events that led to the passage of 295A, highlighting my sense of the core conceptual issues involved in the scandal of 1927. Second, I will argue that had it been passed, 297A, the lost law, would have been an otherwise unprecedented and seemingly impossible thing, a secular blasphemy law. Third, I will make a more speculative argument that I am still very much in the process of thinking through. As framed, 295A turned attention away from a devotee's sense of connection with religious personalities and replaced it with a more abstract notion of decontextualized religious feelings. 295A's religious feelings are seemingly stripped of object or context. They are profoundly impersonal. What, I wonder, are the cultural effects of this legal framing of religious affect? So part one, so I've got three parts, a long part one, giving the history, a longish part two, exploring argument one, the seemingly impossible thing, a secular blasphemy law, then a short and pretty speculative part three, because that's the part I'm still very much trying to think through. So part one, here comes the blasphemy bill. Section 295A was devised to resolve a very particular controversy of the late 1920s. And some people might know this story, but I'll rehearse it for those who don't. In 1924, a Lahore publisher by the name of Mahashay Rajpal issued an anonymous Urdu tract called the Rangila Rasul, the pleasure-loving or flirtatious prophet, a title that the period press tended to render in English as the merry prophet. Rajpal was associated with the Arya Samaj, a Hindu reform society that had become prominent in Lahore over the previous 50 years for, among other things, its polemical attacks on Islam, Sanatanist Hinduism, and other religions. The Rangila Rasul was very much in this polemical vein. It impugns the morals of the Prophet Muhammad by calling attention to his multiple wives and depicting him in a mocking tone as a playboy or dandy. Leaders of Lahore's Muslim community expressed strong disapproval of the tract, and they filed a lawsuit to get it banned under Section 153A of the Indian Penal Code, the section that prohibits publications that create enmity between classes. Because the pamphlet was published anonymously, it was the publisher, not the author, the publisher Rajpal, who was the sole accused. The lawsuit dragged on for 3 years and went through several stages of appeal. The final ruling from the Lahore High Court, as presided over by Justice Kanwar Dalip Singh, was issued in May 1927. Reversing the rulings of two lower courts, Dalip Singh ruled that 153A could not be applied to the Rangila Rasul because the tract could not be proved to create class-based hatred. This idiosyncratic ruling, this tract making fun of the Prophet does not create enmity between Hindus and Muslims, this idiosyncratic ruling, to which I'll return below, produced a full-blown crisis. The major civil societies of Muslim Lahore quickly organized a collective response to the court ruling. They sent petitions to the governor of the Punjab and published editorials in the major newspapers. They also organized large assemblies in public places, including in front of mosques, sometimes in conjunction with Friday prayers. These assemblies soon spread to Delhi and other cities. This public opposition to the court ruling largely abided by the rules and procedures of liberalism as an idiom of public culture. The protest consisted, after all, of petitions, resolutions, and public deliberations. But the mass meetings in particular also called attention to the internal tensions that had beset liberalism since at least the 19th century. The deliberative public was always at risk of metamorphosing into an irrational and potentially violent physical crowd. As though to cue the double valence of the protest, newspapers tended to refer to these mass assemblies as, quote, monster meetings. They were liberal assemblies morphed into liberalism's nightmare alter ego, a monstrous and potentially violent physicality. Meanwhile, the Arya Samaj went about staging a counteroffensive, marshalling its members across North India to support Rajpal and also support Dalip Singh's acquittal of him. The result was a seemingly intractable controversy. Even how to refer to the controversy became a contested matter. Many writers called it the Rangila Rasul affair, but as the Muslim Outlook and other papers insisted, every time that phrase was used, it repeated the original libel against the Prophet Muhammad. The controversy, they said, should be called the Rajpal affair after the publisher. Behind the scenes, British and Indian government officials furiously dashed off letters and memos, sending papers back and forth from Punjab to Delhi and even to London to try to figure out how best to resolve the crisis. Their first tactic was to wait. There were two other court cases that they hoped might undo the damage done by the Dalip Singh's ruling by overturning the precedent set by the Lahore High Court. Even after those two cases were concluded, however, controversy still did not abate. By August, it seemed clear that a new law was needed. In late August, the government published the law it was proposing. This law was then debated and passed at the September 1927 meeting of the Legislative Assembly in Shimla. Henceforth, Section 295A was the law of the land. If you read through the Legislative Assembly debates from that September, you get a very strong sense of how the legislators meant for the new Section 295A to be used. Overwhelmingly, these men agreed that the new law posed very real dangers to free speech. It was, at best, a necessary evil that was passed only because policymakers could see no other way out of the Rangila Rasul crisis. The legislators were particularly keen to clarify that two types of speech about religion should be absolutely exempted from the purview of the new law. One, scholarly research, two, reformist criticism. The former was essential for the advancement of knowledge. The latter was critical to any society's ability to correct long-standing social injustices, such as those around caste and gender. It was partly to protect these two classes of speech that the legislators added the language of deliberate and malicious intent to 295A. They were trying to narrow the scope of the law as much as they could. It was meant only to apply to publications like the Rangila Rasul, the primary intention of which was clearly to offend. There were major figures on the floor in Shimla, including, as we see here, Lala Lajpat Rai, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Madan Mohan Malaviya, and the brilliant legal mind who I discovered while doing this research, Hari Singh Gore. These men's words should, I think, continue to guide the contemporary usage of 295A into the 21st century. This is a very dangerous law that was meant to be limited in scope. Public service announcement over. Thank you. Anyway, now that we have a rough sense of the course of this affair, from May to September of 1927, let's return to where it began. Justice Kanwar Dalip Singh's opinion from the Lahore High Court, which again he published in May, provoking this controversy. Again, Dalip Singh's ruling came as a surprise, partly because it overturned two lower court rulings, both of which had held that the Rangila Rasul was culpable under 153A. In the words of H.L. Palebus, the judge for the initial trial, quote, "Every line is not only prompted by malice, but appears to be the result of rancor and hatred against the Prophet and the religion promulgated by him." End quote. The natural result of such a text would be to incense the Mohammedans toward its author and his perceived sympathizers. Palebus imposed 18 months rigorous imprisonment and a 1,000 rupee fine on Rajpal, in addition to banning the Rangila Rasul. When Rajpal appealed this decision, the judge for the Lahore Sessions Court concurred with the lower court, saying, quote, that an offense under 153A IPC has been fully and clearly established. This ruling seems entirely intuitive. What else was the Rangila Rasul doing, if not stoking enmity between classes? Hence the weirdness of Dalip Singh's ruling. His major argument as to why 153A could not be applied to the Rangila Rasul was that the law only protected communities as they exist in the present. It does not necessarily extend to past iterations of those communities, nor does it extend to deceased individuals like Muhammad. The Rangila Rasul, although undoubtedly, quote, a scurrilous satire on the founder of the Muslim religion, was not therefore also a slander on the Mohammedan religion as such, nor did it position Muslims as objects worthy of enmity or hatred. Defamation of the Prophet, of Muslims, and of Islam are, in short, separate and distinct offenses. Dalip Singh further argues that one must not look beyond the text to see whether, for example, it incites enmity in actual humans. Reception is legally irrelevant for him. Thus, because the text of the Rangila Rasul only slanders the character of the Prophet, and even at one point explicitly says that it is not criticizing the doctrines of Islam, one cannot prove that the tract defames Islam or Muslims. It's just defaming the Prophet. It's sort of a twisted argument in terms of, it's doing a bit of a backflip. Dalip Singh closes his judgment by saying, quote, it seems to me that a clause might well have been added to section 297 of the Indian Penal Code, by which the publication of pamphlets published with the intention of wounding the religious feelings of any person or insulting the religion of any person might be made criminal. I can only say that, speaking for myself, I regret the absence of such a clause, but I am unable to hold that this particular case comes within the purview of 153A. Dalip Singh's reasoning here is truly idiosyncratic. One sees why some period commentators speculated that he may have had some ulterior motive for letting Rajpal off the hook. There are, by my read, at least two different sets of issues raised by the ruling. First is the distinction among personal defamation, group defamation, and the defamation of religion. A libel against the Prophet Muhammad, personal defamation, is not therefore also a libel against Islam, defamation of religion, or against Muslims, group defamation. Second is the even more tortured question of reception. As scholars of law and literature have long noted, courtrooms tend to replay many of the key debates of literary criticism, not least around questions of authorial intent and reader reception. Both these issues are very much at play in the Rajpal case, with Dalip Singh taking a hard line around considering reception. Neither of these concerns, however, seems to have anything to do with the new law that he proposes at the end of his ruling, the one here, the core language of which would, months later, be enacted as 295A. Dalip Singh's mooted 297A is not about protecting deceased sacred persons from libel, nor does it adhere to his standard of textual interpretation. In fact, it makes reception the sole standard of the law. You're not looking at the text at all, only at how people react to it. His choice of number is also puzzling. Section 297 of the Indian Penal Code, so 297A is inserted just after 297. That's how these insertions work, but they tend to have something to do with the law that they're inserted after. Section 297 deals with desecrations of the dead, indignities performed on corpses, interrupted funerals, and the like. 297 makes reference to wounded religious feelings, but it does so explicitly in the context of the dead. So don't wound people's religious feelings by interrupting funerals, performing indignities on corpses, etc. Why call the new law 297A if it wasn't meant to be about protecting deceased persons from defamatory statements, right? All signs seem to point toward a law that would protect deceased persons. But then Dalip Singh doesn't propose such a law. He proposes this much broader law about religious feelings. Given the set of concerns that Dalip Singh laid out in his ruling, the much more obvious solution would have been to frame a law protecting deceased sacred persons like the Prophet from defamatory speech. As I discovered in the course of my research, such a law was proposed in 1927. It's just that it was never enacted. Let me briefly tell you the story of that law. By midsummer of 1927, a semi-organized movement to protect major sacred personalities from defamatory speech had begun to take shape, apparently with a particularly vibrant node in Bombay. It was in Bombay that Sarojini Naidu held the inaugural meeting of what she hoped would be an all-India movement around the slogan, "Respect all religious prophets." G.K. Nariman, a Bombay Parsi scholar, wrote on the same theme, arguing that there should be, quote, limitation to the right of criticism of the lives of founders of religion. By mid-August, there were two different proposals for a law that would have done precisely that, place limitations on the right to criticism of the lives of religious founders. And these laws were put forward in the press by two men, Swami Iyer, a prominent jurist, and Muhammad Ali of the Uncanny movement, although I fear I'm in the stage of research where I'm mixing up my Muhammad Ali's. So I'm pretty sure this is the guy who authors this law that's proposed in a newspaper in late summer of 27, but don't quote me on that. So both the proposed laws were, like the eventual 295A, framed so as to prohibit the wounding of religious feelings. Both, however, specified that the wounds that mattered were those resulting from insults to sacred persons. Here we've got Swami Iyer's law, and I've just highlighted the most pertinent language. I would read the whole thing, but it's like reading a technical legal document. For lo, that's what it is. But whoever by words, signs, or visible representations intended to be heard, read, or seen publishes any remarks of a blasphemous character against any religion or any reputed incarnation thereof, or any prophet, saints, or spiritual leaders revered, etc., to wound feelings, shall be punished. That's one version of this kind of protect sacred persons law that's circulating by late summer of 27. The other version is quite similar. Whoever with the intention of wounding feelings insults, skipping to the highlighted portion, insults any prophet or saint or any other person regarded by any class of persons with similar sanctity, makes or publishes any imputation concerning such a person which lowers his character in the estimation of others. This law is an interest to me partly because it so clearly in its language draws on libel law. This very much framed like a libel law. If you make an imputation against someone that lowers their character, you run afoul of this law. So it's sort of a libel law for the prophet and figures like him, although who gets to count as like a prophet gets to be a tortured question, which you can already see in this list in the first law, where you've got prophets, saints, incarnations, other spiritual leaders. Things begin to get miscellaneous. When the government published so these laws get proposed in early August. The government proposes its own law, what becomes 295A, in late August of 1927. When that's published, there's no mention in it of saints, prophets, incarnations, or any other such sacred persons. This lack of sacred persons in the proposed law prompted public criticism by Muslim groups. The Calcutta Caliphate Conference passed a resolution asking that the proposed law be amended to prohibit slanders against prophets and saints. The Anjuman-e Ahmadiyya likewise asked that it be changed to prohibit insults on sacred personages and, quote, safeguard the honor of prophets, avatars, and founders of all religions. Versions of this same complaint reverberated at the Legislative Assembly in Shimla in September. Thus, for example, Abdul Hayy from Punjab asked that 295A be amended to prohibit, quote, any scurrilous attack or any insult offered to a prophet, to an avatar, to a guru, or the founder of a religion. Note the proliferating nouns. Every list proposed seems to involve one more noun for a religious leader. For some delegates, such a law, such an addition to the code, was the only way to make the law truly responsive to the concerns of the Muslim public. For other delegates at the Legislative Assembly, it was a pragmatic means of narrowing the scope of the proposed law, which people were worried was much too broad. As yet other delegates were quick to point out, however, writing a list of sacred persons into the law was almost guaranteed to produce major problems. As Lajpat Rai's journal, The People, jibed, quote, how shall law define who is a prophet? Will the government of India gazette their names along with the honors list every year? In India, where the number of religions is really beyond calculation, the matter presents a serious difficulty. Besides, if prophets are to be protected, why not the avatars, the gods, the goddesses, the saints? One member of the Legislative Assembly pointed to a further potential absurdity. Would the government grade punishment based on the importance of the figure defamed? 10 years imprisonment for slander against a founder, 7 for a prophet, 5 for a guru, 9 for an avatar, and so on? What about figures like Shivaji, who is neither a saint nor a prophet, but who is looked upon, quote, with feelings bordering on religious reverence? Another member started to worry about the impracticality of offering legal protection to every last of Hinduism's, quote, many gods and godlings. But at this point, discussion broke down. Somebody objected that the word godlings was offensive to his religious feelings. Thus did the proposal to frame a law protecting prophets collapse almost immediately around a seemingly insoluble conceptual problem. A problem that I, as a scholar located in religious studies, would describe as a problem of comparative religion. Proponents of the law wanted to protect the prophet and figures like him, but like is a fraught word. What kind of category does it constitute? What kind of connections does it define? Who, in short, is like the prophet? Here, as elsewhere, the problem of religious comparison was partly a problem of translation. One can see this, for example, in Hindi language coverage of Naidu's Respect All Prophets movement. In an August 1927 article in the Allahabad-based weekly Abhyuday, edited by M.M. Malaviya, the English language name of the movement is translated into Hindi using Perso-Arabic, which is to say Urdu vocabulary, Sabhi Pegambaran ki izzat karo. This is then paraphrased into a much more Sanskritized and thus Hinduized Hindi. People should respect sab dharma ke acharyam, with Pegambar following acharya in brackets. Is an acharya, a religious preceptor, really the same thing as a Pegambar, a messenger prophet? The short answer obviously is no, but the very fact that one has to frame the question at all indicates the sorts of difficulties that arise from the effort to generalize the particularity of the Prophet Muhammad into a pan-religious category. This problem was writ large at the Legislative Assembly. In short, for totally pragmatic reasons, the idea of a law protecting prophets was scrapped. There was no consistency in how to refer to this idea. For the sake of clarity, I'm calling it 127A, a logical extension of the law protecting religious feelings by protecting the dead. The idea rose and fell, leaving only the slightest of traces. In fact, one notable trace in particular. Section 295A uses the word religion or versions of it 3 different times in what seemed to some period critics like useless redundancy. Why have the duplication in particular about religion or religious beliefs? Why not just say insulting religion? Why have this extra phrase in the law? As the special committee at the Legislative Assembly that crafted the law explained, this duplication, religion and or religious beliefs, was meant to reflect the desire to protect sacred personages. Dalip Singh had distinguished in his ruling between slanders against Islam and slanders against the Prophet. The framers of the law wanted to make sure that it covered both kinds of insults. So religion here is meant to indicate Islam and things in the category that would include Islam. Religious beliefs is meant to cover sundry discrete aspects of a given religion, including, for example, prophets, etc. 295A thus takes a mode of religion based around affection for persons, for prophets, and transmutes that affection into a much drier and perhaps more cognitive notion of religion. How weird to have the prophet replaced by this sort of anodyne, abstract phrase, religious beliefs. In India, 295A stands alone as the major word on blasphemy. In Pakistan, meanwhile, it was joined in the 1980s by a 295B that protects the Quran, a 295C that prohibits derogatory remarks about the Prophet, about Muhammad and other prophets, and a 295-8A that prohibits derogatory remarks about holy personages. These Pakistani laws strongly echo, I think, the lost law of 1927 in ways that underscore the whole left when that law faltered. There's a perceived need some 60 years later to create similar laws. They're definitely well beyond the scope of my talk today, but I'd be happy to hear any thoughts that anyone who knows more about the Pakistani laws of the 1980s than I do, any thoughts you guys might have during the Q&A. So that's part 1. Now, part 2, secularizing blasphemy. We now all have a sense of what happened in 1927. The publication of the Rangila Rasul, the passage of 295A, the rise and fall of an idea for a different kind of law, what I'm calling 297A. Let me now try to explain why I think this history is interesting and important. I'll explore 2 different arguments today, the first in some depth, the second much more briefly. My first argument runs as follows. There has never been a secular blasphemy law, at least as I'm defining it. 297A, the lost law of 1927, is perhaps as close to a secular blasphemy law as is possible. It was, or would have been, a novel experiment and thus an important chapter in the global history of legal secularism. That it faltered on pragmatic grounds and was replaced by a law that is notably devoid of religious contents tells us something important about legal secularism. When it sets out to protect religion, it tends to do so only indirectly, and perhaps must do so only indirectly. And let me say also that when I say there never has been, I am inviting people to contradict me. Let me set up my argument, and if you can come up with an example that contradicts my "this has never existed" claim, please do tell me. First, what do I mean by blasphemy? According to the Standard Dictionary definition, blasphemy is an act of insulting or showing contempt for God, or by extension, anything considered sacred. Etymologically, the theme in blasphemy is the same root as in euphemism. Blasphemy is about speech, or at least words. It is, I would say, also thus inseparable from questions of mediation. Or, to use terms that became common in 19th century jurisprudence, blasphemy is more about manner than matter. A person can say what they like about religion, so long as they do so in terms that are respectful and decorous. For my purposes, however, defining blasphemy as primarily a stylistic offense leaves too many questions unresolved. In particular, it sets aside the question of harms, the baneful effects that blasphemous words are presumed to produce in the world. I would enumerate 4 distinct types of harms that have at various points been associated with blasphemy. And I would say, I'm not sort of citing most of the scholarship that's been helpful to me. I somehow, for this one, threw in Jeremy Waldron's The Harm and Hate Speech, which has been helpful to me as I try to think through what's going on in blasphemy law. So I would enumerate 4 distinct kinds of harms that have been associated with blasphemy. 1, metaphysical harms, which is to say harms to the divine or to the cosmos, that blasphemous speech actually produces a change in the fabric of existence in some way. 2, harms to the state. 3, harms to the public peace. And 4, psychological harms. I think it's analytically useful to reserve the term blasphemy law for laws addressing the first 2 kinds of harms. So I would tend to use blasphemy law to refer only to laws dealing with these 2. There is, moreover, I think, historically, a clear trend, at least within common law traditions, toward replacing blasphemy laws framed around the first 2 kinds of harm, narrowly construed, with laws about religious speech that are engineered around harms 3 and 4, or what I would call laws of religious offense, a category that after the 1980s verges into hate speech law. My understanding is that the term hate speech dates to the 1980s. I think it makes sense to call this a secularizing trend, although I've got a great deal of ambivalence around using the word secularizing here. I would also suggest that we can see the history of blasphemy law with greater clarity if we study colonial and metropolitan English legal history within a single analytic frame. The modern law of blasphemy, although now in global press often associated with India and Pakistan, is not an anachronism brought into the present by an atavistic East. It is the product of the internal tensions and contradictions of colonial modernity itself. And Gowrie Viswanathan, among other people, have written about that. In 1927, the new Section 295A was proposed under the official title, the Religious Insults Bill. Popularly, however, it was often referred to as the Blasphemy Bill. This, I think, was a misnomer. As M.R. Jayakar of Bombay clarified at the Legislative Assembly, quote, "Somebody spoke here of blasphemy, but that is an entirely different offense. In England, it is an offense per se against religion. The state, as upholder of the church, protects people from irreligion. In India, there can, or at least should, be no statute against blasphemy in that sense." The legal theorist Hari Singh Gore made much the same point. In Britain, it is the duty of the king and the parliament to protect the established church. Quote, "But is that the position of the government of India? Are the government of India the defender of the faith, or of any faith in this country? I submit, sir, they are the defender of the peace, and not the defender of the faith. And they may only frame laws directed at breaches of the peace." Jayakar and Gore are, in my view, quite correct. British India had no blasphemy laws, at least not under the Indian Penal Code. 295A, as proposed and enacted, remained on the model of that earlier document. I mean, it's part of the code and very much in the idiom of the code. The lost law, 297A, however, was a law of a different kind. It would, in fact, have concerned offenses per se against religion, to recall Jayakar's phrase. Unlike British blasphemy law, however, it sought to protect all religions, not just Christianity. I mean, courts in Britain ruled as recently as the 1970s, no, like the 80s, that Britain blasphemy law only protects the Church of England. Only Anglicans are protected. To see the novelty of 297A more clearly, let us backtrack a bit, quite a bit in fact, to look at the longer history of blasphemy in English common law. I'll narrate this history via my 4 types of harm, starting with metaphysical harms. In the English Middle Ages, it was apparently commonly believed that taking the Lord's name in vain resulted in physical injury to the body of Jesus in heaven. One late medieval mural depicts the Virgin Mary holding the maimed body of Christ amid a circle of blasphemers. You can see, if you look closely enough, the image quality isn't great, but you can see Jesus's calf bone hanging out, where his foot has come off over here, and his bone is protruding. So the idea expressed by this mural is that the blasphemous words uttered by the blasphemers gathered around the Pietà in the middle have actually physically damaged the body of Christ. This is the sort of thing I would refer to as metaphysical harms. As far as I know, such blasphemous utterances were not usually prosecuted within secular courts. They were grammatical of ecclesiastical or simply divine concern in medieval England. This, however, changed in the early modern period. In 1676, a man named John Taylor was tried in the court at the King's Bench for having uttered the words, quote, "Christ is a whoremaster, and religion is a cheat." His name is John Taylor. I always get his name confused and want to call him James Taylor, but that is a different person. According to Lord Chief Justice Hale, who presided over this case, such words constituted an offense, quote, "not only to God and religion, but also to the state, insofar as Christianity is parcel of the laws of England." Hale's ruling remained the authoritative word on blasphemy well into the 19th century, by which time it seemed positively medieval, both Puritan and theocratic. This common gloss on Hale's ruling is, however, a mistake, or so literary historian Elliot Visconsi has argued. Hale's ruling was, in fact, innovative, modern, and secularizing. He was asserting the Crown's jurisdiction over what had previously been the preserve of ecclesiastical courts. It was only insofar as blasphemous words produce worldly harm against the state that the state can claim the right to govern them. During the long 18th century, Protestantism remained central to a newly consolidated British identity. By the 1830s, however, consensus around religion's place in the national imaginary had begun to unravel. It was at this moment that Thomas Macaulay drafted the Indian Penal Code. In the mid-1830s, Macaulay was substantially aligned with the utilitarians. It was James Mill, after all, who got him his gig as law commissioner in Calcutta. The code that Macaulay produced was thus drafted on Benthamite principles, albeit inconsistently. This was to be a legal code structured around natural or a priori categories, rather than the accreted tradition of common law, with those natural a priori categories adjusted as needed to fit local circumstance, as in India. Macaulay expressed his hope that his code, once tested in the laboratory of the colony, could provide a model for legal reform in the metropole. This, in fact, almost happened. There were multiple proposals between the 1880s and the 2000s for the UK to adopt India's religious insult laws, including, by the 2000s, 295A. There were discussions of this in Parliament during that time period. The Indian Penal Code was a reformist document, part of the archive of legal secularism. It very intentionally omitted blasphemy, a topic that Macaulay had spoken about in Parliament earlier in the 1830s, and replaced blasphemy with offenses concerning religion. The 1860 version of the code, a slight alteration of the original 1837 draft, included 4 such offenses against religion. 1, defiling sacred places and objects. 2, disturbing religious assemblies. 3, defiling the dead. And 4, speaking religiously insulting words. This last law, is 298, only mentions spoken words and thus didn't apply to printed text like the Rangila Rasul. I'm still trying to figure out why it was framed that way. I think it has something to do with Macaulay's sort of classist understanding of literacy in print media in the 1830s, but I'm not entirely sure of that. So 2 of these 4 sections explicitly mention wounding religious feelings, and the religion chapter's preamble indicates that the governance of feelings is at the heart of the code's governance of religion. To quote Macaulay, the religion may be false, but the pain which such insults give to the professors of that religion is real, end quote. I'm inclined to read this mention of pain as part of a utilitarian calculus, an aggregated or populational effort to reduce pain and produce pleasure, and the technical Benthamite sense of that term. If this reading is correct, then the Indian Penal Code's rules on religion situate religious affect as the object of one of the most canonically Foucauldian forms of governmentality. These feelings are simultaneously individual and populational. They are of all and each at the same time. They are also, and not incidentally, strongly linked to the specter of violence. Rough words turn all too easily into rough action, and it was on the grounds of protecting the public peace that Macaulay wanted to regulate religion and religious speech at all. The Indian Penal Code thus emphatically replaces harms 1 and 2, metaphysical harms and harms against the state, with harms 3 and 4, harms to the public peace and psychological harms, with those latter 2 harms emerging as the only legitimate objects of concern for a modern secular state. If, in India, this revised vision of how a state should regulate religiously offensive speech had taken full shape by 1860, in Britain the process took longer. A series of court cases between the 18-teens and 1880s led to a major shift in blasphemy law. And here, the latter sets of these court cases had to do with a publication called The Freethinker, which included a number of cartoons, including this one humorously of Moses getting a back view as God walks away from him on Mount Sinai. So this was taken to court as a blasphemous image, and here we've got Judge Coleridge, who presided over the case. In a landmark 1883 ruling, Lord Chief Justice John Coleridge, great-nephew of the poet, held that it was the matter, not the manner, of an allegedly blasphemous expression that was legally relevant. In short, you can say whatever you want to about Jesus, so long as you do so with decency, that most Victorian of virtues. The decency standard had a strongly classed dimension, with the working classes much more likely to use words that seemed obscene to elite jurists. But that arguably was precisely the point. The courts were worried only about words so rough that they threatened to tip over into physical violence, which was also strongly associated with unruly urban crowds. Coleridge's decency standard was cited occasionally by the Indian press in 1920, as well as by members of the Legislative Assembly, and some of the words that Coleridge uses in this 1883 ruling do end up in 295A, including the word outrage. I think this ruling is importantly part of the legal history of this law that's still very much on the books in India. Moreover, the patrician attitude implied by Coleridge's ruling was also relevant in India. As Pundit Thakur Das Bhargava said of the noble feelings about religious tolerance that many of his colleagues in Shimla had expressed, quote, if India were constituted of inhabitants like those who came into this assembly, there would be no trouble. All the same, sir, you will excuse me if I point out that the man in the street has not got these noble things, these sentiments of tolerance in his heart. It's the same sort of patrician condescension to the unruly mob. In this long legal history, there's a clear trend away from offering protection to religion per se. Increasingly, throughout the 19th century, it was religious feelings that became the object of the law. This meant that blasphemy law, narrowly construed, seemed on its way out, a process that would take another 120 years in Britain. Blasphemy law is part of the law of the UK until 2008. The short-lived 297A, protecting prophets, would have reversed this trend. It was, in fact, a blasphemy law, offering protection to religion per se. Unlike British blasphemy law, however, it attempted to be religiously neutral, to remain equidistant from all religions, abiding by a principle that we now, thanks to the work of Rajiv Bhargava and others, recognize as part of India's distinctive varietal of secularism. In theory, it would be possible for India to remain secular while protecting religion per se from insult, so long as it protected all religions equally. In practice, it's probably impossible to do this, as was sort of decided in 1927, but this theoretical possibility of crafting a secular blasphemy law that offers protection to all religions, and religion per se, had not yet been explored in 1927. What we see, I think, in the rise and fall of 297A is a loose network of Indian thinkers trying to work through the implications of a still emergent Indian secularism. They are asking, in effect, is it possible for an Indian secularism to enact a blasphemy law that offers direct protection to religion rather than simply the indirect protection afforded by laws on religious offense? What are the possibilities of a distinctly subcontinental secular logic? When lawmakers decided that a secular blasphemy law would be impossible to the point of absurdity, they ditched the idea. Instead, they would frame a law that protected religion only indirectly, following what at that point was a relatively well-established model. Religion is not the object of 295A, it's just a router word, a transponder node connecting the colonial state to the excitable affects of its subjects. Part 3, the short part, a speculative conclusion-ish. I want to close this talk with a speculative thought, which I'm hoping to develop further as I continue to work on this project. 295A offers up a notably impersonal species of religious affect. Its legal feelings are fully bureaucratic things. They are routinized, rationalized passions, a sort of Weberian parody of actual human emotions. This is all the more striking given that persons nearly landed in the law. A generation of religious studies scholars have pointed to the problems of conceptualizing religion in terms of beliefs. And of course, there that word is in 295A. In the law, it is a direct substitute for a much more embodied and phenomenologically thick idea, that of sacred personages. In thinking about 295A, I keep coming back to this fact, to these two very different models of what religion is and what religion does. On the one hand, we have a mode of religious affect that institutes connections between persons, that draws religious subjects out of themselves and intricates them with charismatic persons or beings. On the other hand, we have a mode of religious affect that continually returns the subject to his or her own feelings, or perhaps better, that returns the subject to the circulation of affect within a class of formally interchangeable persons. The first model of religious affect is hierarchical, the second perhaps more egalitarian, but this egalitarianism comes with a certain erasure of lived specificity. One historical fact that has thus far gone unexplored in the scholarship is that the Rangila Rasul was published concurrently with the centennial celebrations of the birth of Swami Dayananda Saraswati, born in Gujarat in 1824. Dayananda, who had founded the Arya Samaj in 1875, and it was the Arya Samajis who published the Rangila Rasul in 1924. And it was known that Rangila Rasul was supposed to be a response to a tract making fun of Dayananda, ostensibly published by Muslims. What hasn't been explored is the broader backdrop of Arya Samaji publishing at this precise moment. To commemorate this event, Dayananda Centennial, Arya Samajis published a significant number of biographies of the Swami, some of which included images like this one, which comes from a book in 1924. These biographies defined the masculinity of the Swami, these biographies defined the masculinity of Dayananda around his sexual self-control. They thus provide an important context for the Rangila Rasul's depiction of the Prophet Muhammad as sexually profligate. In the Arya Samaji writings of the mid-1920s, Dayananda and Muhammad are inverse figures. Both were also part of a broader literary field that sought to present exemplary lives to the Indian reading public in order to facilitate the moral uplift of the nation en route to self-rule. This project was front and center in one of the earliest biographies of Dayananda, written by Lala Lajpat Rai in the 1890s as part of a longer series that included lives of both political figures like Giuseppe Mazzini and sacred figures like Krishna. And part of what's interesting about that is you've got, Krishna, the avatar, sort of equated to a religious leader or figure like Mazzini or Dayananda Saraswati. There's a way in which the sort of equation of the avatar with religious founders and guru figures feels to me an anticipation of this list of religious figures that happens in 1927. Saba Mahmood, in her essay on the Danish cartoon affair, writes compellingly about how the Prophet Muhammad functions as an ethical exemplar, working his way into the very selfhood of the Muslim subjects who emulate his actions, whence the sense of violation as seeing the Prophet defamed. It seems to me that a similar structure was at play in early 20th century India, although it needs to be historicized differently and carefully. What kinds of print-mediated ethical practices of self-fashioning shaped the cultural life of sacred personalities in the 1920s? How might this larger cultural field have intersected with the Rajpal affair? To pursue these questions, one could, of course, look in any number of directions. In my work, I've been exploring not only Arya hagiographies, but also the history of libel law in Indian translations of Victorian self-help books. For today, suffice it to say that if 295A worked to occlude this larger historical scene by reducing it to actionable religious feelings, it also opens a critical window onto the very histories that it sought to resolve. The members of the 1927 Legislative Assembly were clearly correct when they predicted that 295A would be used to curtail free speech about religion. I would say that they were prophetic, but in this context, that might actually have legal implications. Sorry, bad joke, they were prophets. Anyway, surely, always end the talk in a bad pun, that's what I say. Surely the best way to undo this prophecy of 1927 is to talk more about 295A, peeling it open to reveal the unresolved histories that it contains. Thank you.
You want to field questions?
I can field questions. Great. Yeah.
What I was waiting for in this is the larger context of missionary activity in all of this.
Yeah.
And I'd always assumed that part of the debate would have been something to say, well, we can frame these things as long as it doesn't prevent us from converting people.
Yeah, I mean, so the question of missionary activity is a large one. And for me, where it enters this story is more in the 19th century, that the culture of religious controversy that the Arya Samaj was so firmly a part of was, I mean, many or most scholars would say, really pushed by missionaries starting around the mid-19th century. And when the Arya Samaj comes on the scene in the 1870s and 80s, they sort of craft their public idiom by looking at the missionaries and, host public debates against Protestant missionaries. And so the sorts of scurrilous things that were getting said were crafted in the late 19th century in a field that definitely included missionaries. But I think by the early 20th century, the missionaries were less prominent in lots of ways.
No, I was thinking about particularly Macaulay framing the IPC.
Yeah.
Does he can't, okay, I'll just leave it.
Yeah, and I mean, so he does not, that I've seen, talk explicitly about missionaries. And I mean, missionaries were always sort of a fraught issue for the British. I mean, Macaulay crafts the IPC as part of the 1833 charter renewal, which of course had its own sort of stipulations on missionaries. But I think that, I mean, if you look at the way he frames these four laws, it seems to have more to do with maintaining the peace among excitable, like religiously excitable and affective Indian subjects. They don't, to me, those laws to me don't seem to have missionaries in mind.
Exactly what was going on. But the presumption is, I mean, our standard narrative is right that to begin with, when the British came, they prevented missionaries from coming.
Yeah.
Then, post the early 19th century, missionaries are allowed because, after all. Then you get to, little Henry and his bear Boozy talking about popularly in popular literature about converting the whole of India to Christianity, which was something that was, I assumed, a much more important, that about the time that Macaulay is framing.
Yeah, but of course Macaulay, I mean, there are ways in which, I mean, debates around the role of missionaries in India get to be related to debates around the role of Christianity in framing British identity and framing the legitimacy of the British state. And Macaulay was slippery on this issue, but I think the version of Macaulay that writes the Indian Penal Code, I mean, is to some extent a Benthamite. I mean, or at least he's thinking with utilitarians for whom religion absolutely should not be the symbolic ground of the state. And I mean, insofar as the Indian Penal Code is a reformist document, it seems very keen to not do that, right? I mean, it's like, one of the things I'm interested in the Indian Penal Code, and this feels like stating the obvious, I mean, it's framed around the general category religion and is not written around Hinduism, Islam, or Christianity in particular. And that I actually think is in some ways a departure from earlier bodies of law that the British have been crafting in India, which had been crafted around Hinduism and Islam as discrete empirical entities. Here we have religion instead, neither Christianity nor Hinduism nor Islam. I mean, Macaulay seems to be working through something like what I would want to call a secular mode of governance that would, I think, even in the 1830s, be at odds with a version of empire that would see Christianity or missionary work as integral to the moral mission of empire. In Macaulay, I mean, he's something, like he does in public claim to be an Anglican. He thinks that you need to have some kind of religion to maintain the social order. Certainly that's the case for him by the 1850s, maybe less so in the 1830s. But the version of Macaulay that writes the code seems to be closer to a secularist, and thus at odds, I think, probably with the impulse to get missionaries into the subcontinent. Yeah.
I have a bit of a more methodological question. When you, I'm just going to back it up, I'm sorry. But when you began to argue about an interpretation or a hermeneutic idea as to why blasphemy laws exist, and then transferred to a more prescriptive idea that the law gives as to why religious reasons should not make its presence in the public sphere. You began to give us different kinds of justifications to move from that sort of hermeneutic idea of a moral order to a more prescriptive idea of the law. And the justifications went from harm to matter, not manner, and then to a definition of religion in three different contexts. I'm wondering what it does to the nature of justification itself if we are to argue that the justification to make something that is religious reasons into a prescriptive idea of the law, what happens to the nature of justification itself? Is it something that is necessarily relational and structural, and therefore we're appealing to Barton's conception of Indian secularism? Or does that justification just merely begin to derive on what Macaulay, etc., considered unjust?
Right, so I think help me see if I'm understanding the question. I mean, there's a question about, I mean, one of the questions is, what's the relationship between doing a descriptive analytic historical inquiry into 295A, which is what I think I'm mostly doing, where I'm trying to look at how various historical actors who've thought about the law how they have framed their justifications, and trying to notice trying to notice historical shifts in the kinds of justifications that are used. There's then an important question about normative legal theory in the present. I mean, how does one craft policy in the present, and what kinds of normative justifications would one use for arguing for and against different laws? I'm not necessarily engaged in a normative project, although I am at times inclined to making normative claims, or at least to cite approvingly other people making normative claims about, for example, the potential dangers of 295A. Mostly, though, I see myself as a person. I'm not a historian. My PhD is in religion. I work in archives, but tend to ask questions that look slightly different than the questions historians ask, partly because my work is more interpretivist than empirical in thrust. My work is primarily descriptive analytic. I'm trying to look at the range of different kinds of ideas that have circulated around blasphemy, say, in the hopes that by excavating a number of different ideas and exploring their internal logic, I might produce something that would be useful to people who are trying to do normative work in the present and craft policy around things like blasphemy law and religious speech. But to my mind, that is a different job and one that takes special training and skills, and it is not my job. Is that?
Oh, sure. Can I just?
Yeah, of course.
I asked the question because of the appeal that you made towards the end, towards an Indian version of secularism, Lashpatrai's writing on Dayananda Saraswati and that old body of text, because they're beginning to employ, an idea which you employ, religious affect, as a sort of necessary, not necessarily normative justification, but a sort of relational justification as to why religious reasons in the public sphere need to be considered in a fairly more complex way.
Right. The question of the history of Indian secularism is immensely interesting for all kinds of questions, and it's a long history that goes back, within the British period alone to the 18th century at least. It's not clear to me that people in India are using the word secularism per se routinely, maybe until around the 1920s. And then there are additional shifts in the 1940s. So the Rangila Rasul affair is this interesting moment where, you do see the word secular getting thrown around in the press coverage. And so Julia Stevens has written some about this, looking at the Rangila Rasul affair, trying to track how people are using the word secular and what this particular event would tell us about a cultural history of Indian secularism in the early part of the 20th century. The role of affect in it is interesting, and that I think is not just in Indian history. Here, I think India is part of a much transnational legal history, and the speculative thought I'm having at the end, there is just something, any sort of legal framing of religion is necessarily reductive and has to be reductive. That's what law is. It can't not be reductive in its effort to describe culture or the world. But any reductive rendering of religion actually can have pretty strong cultural effects in terms of the kinds of religious practices it permits or encourages. And I'm just trying to think through what is this very reductive, what kinds of religious feelings we see talked about in the Indian Penal Code. Whatever they are a substantial remove from real life, from the dense networks of affective relations in which actual human beings live and move. I'm sort of asking it of myself as an open-ended question, what does that do? What is it to have these highly abstract, decontextualized religious feelings that nonetheless get cited, right? People will talk about their own religious lives via the law. I feel like this has been written about more in the U.S. context, perhaps at this point, than in the Indian context. The law on religion shapes actual religious practice, and so I'm just kind of curious in framing that question around 295A. Yeah, Nick.
I had a question, just more about in your research on this paper and stuff, whether you found what was the Arya Samaj saying about these amendments to the Penal Code, what was happening, or what was, maybe not just the Arya Samaj, but what were other people saying or writing about this stuff that was going on? Or was the sort of legal due process of all of this relatively closed off in these public controversies and other things?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I fear that I'm still sort of like in the thick of actually reading through things that I've gathered. So I don't have, I think, an adequate answer to your question at this point. I mean, the debates around 295A are one place where you can really see people debating this law, and some people saying this is a terrible idea, and other people saying we need to have this regardless. I mean, one thing that is pretty clear is that the Arya Samaj and other religious groups pretty quickly latch onto these laws as a means of furthering controversy, and of course this was predicted already by the lawmakers and by others that this law, which is meant to reduce controversy, will perversely tend to increase controversy, which I mean arguably is in fact what's happened. So you can see that already. So I have worked some on this controversy in the 1940s, where there was an effort to get the Satyat Prakash, the Light of Truth, the sort of one of the founding texts of the movement, to get it banned in Sindh in the 1940s because of the things it says about the Prophet Muhammad. Dayananda says all kinds of nasty things about lots of people, including the Prophet. So it gets banned in Sindh. And it's interesting to watch how ordinary people in tracts and in all kinds of ways are absorbing the language from these legal documents. And it's not just 295A, it's the other sections concerning religion. And as legal phrases enter popular discourse, they often get mixed up in ways where, sort of a phrase from one statute gets used to talk about another statute, and the broader cultural life of law, sort of like strict legal precedence, is often less relevant than emotional appeal. But it does seem pretty clear that these statutes do serve sort of larger role in controversy. Yeah, Joel.
Can I just ask you to bring it a little bit further into the present? I mean, it seems like a law like this, as we know, if you look on social media, and every other week it seems like some professor at JNU gets called up for making a comment on Facebook or something. Have there been attempts to tinker with the language and intent and things like that to make some of these kind of apparently frivolous suits to minimize that, or is there?
So I would say, I, for better or for worse, I sort of decided at the outset of this project that I would not be dealing with post-47 for all kinds of reasons. The archives are different. At some point, one starts to need actual legal expertise. For all kinds of reasons, I sort of decided not to do post-47. I will say that when the law was put into place in the 1920s, it was set up. There was concern that there was too low a threshold to file a suit. Obviously, it just wouldn't do to have a law that says that anyone who feels offended can file a lawsuit. So it was put into the law that only government could file suits under the law. So you have to sort of, the police can collect reports on an alleged instance of religious offense, but only the government of India could file a lawsuit. And I believe that's still the case. I believe that. I believe it's still the case. So a lot of these controversies, there's talk of 295A, but a suit doesn't get filed, is my impression. But again, it's sort of beyond, I demarcated my line in the sand. I certainly hope that what I'm doing will be useful to people thinking about the present, but I'm trying to keep myself to the longer period, partly because there's so much there. One thing that I've been looking into in the past couple of weeks are the ways in which 295A grows out of 124A, the sedition law. That in English common law, blasphemous libel and seditious libel were related offenses that did not even, I think, begin to be clearly disarticulated from each other until the early 19th century, around the 18 teens. And so in India, this also became somewhat unclear. Macaulay put a number of sections on sedition, waging war against the Queen, into the code. 124A gets added in 1870. That then gets spun out into 153A, the section about the code that's about producing enmity between classes. 153A is at first a clause that's going to get added to 124A in 1898 because those two things are the same in the common law of sedition, creating enmity between classes and sedition. Someone says, no, that doesn't make any, that's historical happenstance in England. It's irrational and not natural. We need natural categories for England. These should be two separate offenses. And then there's a way in which 295A gets spun out of, or in response to 153A. This sort of this sequence of events. While all three of those things would have been covered by sedition law-ish in England. which is a messier set of offenses. So it's just, the colonial period is so rich, I'd let other people do post 47.
Fair. And so the idea of intent, I mean, how is that determined?
Yeah, and so that, how is intent determined? And again, I mean, I haven't looked at recent jurisprudence, so I don't know. But it's clearly there to mean that only tracts that seem primarily intended to offend, like it's overwhelmingly clear that this thing was published to offend people. As, I mean, surely the Rangila Rasul was, right? I mean, what else is that tract doing? You're not trying to offend somebody, and that is different in kind. Yeah, they like in the Legislative Assembly debates in 27, they talk about like various European classics that could potentially be construed as offensive, but they would want to be protected. So like Voltaire, they're like, whatever this law does, we should still be able to read Voltaire. So that it would be a text that might offend some people, but it's not published with malicious intent. It's published, again, the two things they talk about routinely are scholarship on religion and bona fide criticism, by which they mean a criticism of, say, caste or something, like criticism that's meant earnestly to change a social practice and that is not done with the primary purpose of hurting feelings. But yeah, these are like necessarily nebulous terms.
Isn't sedition a secular blasphemy law?
Yeah, there's a newspaper article that was published in the 1900s, the aughts, that was talking about like sedition prosecutions at that moment and called them secular heresy. And was saying that people, once upon a time, God's law ruled the land, and now the Indian Penal Code rules the land, and there are black-habited Penal Code Maulavis who run around and making sure people worship the Indian Penal Code. But it's sort of suggesting that like the English state, in trying to immunize itself against criticism, was in effect creating a secular blasphemy law by setting the state as that which is over and above criticism.
So then how is 297 a novel?
Is novel in that it's about religion per se in a way that's not linked to the symbolic function of the state. That the British state in India went to some trouble to divest itself of religious trappings. That, of course, is always incomplete, but I mean, its primary, whatever its argument for symbolic legitimacy was, did not have to do with its being a Christian state. That was not its argument to legitimacy. And so 295A would have protected all religions per se from injurious speech, and actually like written them into the law with concrete nouns.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, yeah, so like, I'm like, this is like the argument I'm thinking through. This seems to me unusual and specific. Like, I don't know of another law like it, and it seems interesting to me. I'm trying to sort of like unpack what's going on here, or why it strikes me as interesting that the lost law, sort of has this hilariously proliferating list of names of different kinds of persons. There's no, in Britain, the law only protects Christianity. There are other countries with what I would describe as blasphemy laws, including Pakistan, where you can have like a finite set of nouns because it's just Islam that's at stake. But if you're trying to protect all religions equally using concrete nouns, you run into a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a follow-up question to what you just said. So isn't that, would you not see that as having something to do with how the colonial state imagined itself as not just another, like it wouldn't be the same as, say, the Indian state now or the Pakistani state or the British state at that time, but to see itself as the neutral arbiter between different communities that people have argued. So in that case, how is it then, why would you see it as, say, doing a novel gesture in a secular gesture because it talks about like all religions as an equidistant from it? Instead, I would, for instance, see it as being actually not being novel or unique or going out of the way, but being on the same page as like maintaining its image as as an entity above the warring communities in India. So, why do you see that as secular and not as in sync with the colonial, the image of the colonial state?
Yeah, I mean, in this, I would say that the colonial state's argument to legitimacy is that which stands over warring religious communities to arbitrate among them. And so some notion of the state as secular, what it seems to me, was mostly really central to colonial rule and the colonial state's argument to legitimacy. And so certainly the offenses concerning religion in the Indian Penal Code were an important part of this project. By presenting Indian religious communities as being constantly at loggerheads, the colonial state could thus make a strong argument to its own legitimacy. The question then becomes, well, how does this, what I'm calling 297A, how does that fit into this larger story? And I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, had such a law been crafted, it would, had it been enacted, it would have further legitimated the state as that which symbolically stands above the concrete and empirical details of religion to regulate and govern them. And so it maintains the colonial state's primary mode of power. But the colonial state, so what my argument to novelty has solely to do with the history of blasphemy law, that the colonial state had never said, thou shalt not defame the prophet or Krishna, or, the colonial state hadn't tried to protect religion per se against speech or symbolic violence. It had been trying to manage what happened to be important to its, superstitious and or religiously excitable colonized subjects. It's a slight shift where in Britain, religion, Christianity, had been central to the symbolic articulation of state power. And the colonial state had intentionally not done that in India. And so to then write particular religious symbols into the law as receiving explicit protection from the law seems just a shift to me in how a secular state is conceiving of its relationship to the specific contents of religion. Religion isn't that which stands outside of the law, is that which needs to be governed. Religion within this lost law would have been something actually inside the law in a specific way, that it's about concrete nouns, specific contents. So again, I'm not sure, it's definitely not a decisive shift in, say, like the secular logic of colonial governance. It's a continuation of that. It just seems like an interesting twist in the history of blasphemy to me. Yeah.
So again, this question of novelty, I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this, because that was a lot, thank you. It seems to me that there's at least part of the distinction being made between 295 and 297 is a centering of, even if you accept the Indian state views itself as secular and as sort of an adjudicating body over warring religious communities, the nature of what constitutes those religious communities seems to be different between 295 and 297, right? So 297 sort of seems to be assuming that religious groups are centered around people, whereas 295 seems to be suggesting that it's actually centered around abstract beliefs, right? Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that there's something here that's also kind of constitutive in some way of kind of like a larger attitude of what exactly religion is supposed to be. Yeah. And I'm wondering about that then in relation to, you brought to our attention these sort of spiritual persons kind of movements, but also I'm wondering about that in relation, so we're talking about the Arya Samaj, but also to like Neo-Vedanta, or particularly in my research, I've encountered pretty novel interpretations, for instance, of Jainism, where you have people arguing that sadhus and sadhvis, who are usually seen to be as sort of the traditional bedrock, holy people who are the center of religious life, are actually just superfluous because the reality is, it's the teachings that matter. So I'm wondering about the way that kind of narrative of religiosity is both constituted in this sort of legal encounter, but also comes from Indian actors themselves, right? That like our religions are actually the true teachings of Christ of blah, 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 and aren't centered around people. Because it seems that there's actually a bit of a illusion that can kind of happen where I think on some level the idea of insulting the Prophet Muhammad as being insulting to Muslims seems very obvious, but on another level there's something slightly different about saying something bad about Muhammad and saying something bad about the things Muslims believe, if that makes sense. So I'm just wondering about the kind of latency issue that appears there.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I'm trying. That's helpful. As you say, a number of religious reform movements over the previous, 50 or 70 years had precisely been reframing religion around belief for all kinds of reasons that had to do with colonial encounter, that had to do with rendering religion legible under the law. That this is not just a top-down legal thing to write religious belief into the law and replace persons. It is resonant with a much broader stratum of colonial culture. You ended with a question, but I was too busy writing down the thought that you expressed 10 seconds earlier to actually hear the question.
I guess I'm just wondering, what you see as the sort of operative distinction or something being made then between insulting a person as a mode of insulting a religion versus insulting the ideas of a religion as an insult, which is to say the shift from a concrete agent or something to a sort of abstract idea or something, and how that relates to feelings. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, right. So your question is about the part of the talk and the part that is underdeveloped because it's about the part of the book that I haven't written yet, or I'm still sort of thinking through those questions myself. It just seems really like one doesn't often think about religion as being constituted of interlinked networks of affective actors, human beings in relationship with other human beings, whether dead or alive, or sort of mediated depictions of those human beings. As someone in the 1920s in India did not have their relationship to the Prophet Muhammad was highly mediated by print and by different kinds of texts and different kinds of practices. We don't think about religion oftentimes as being constituted as a field of sociality, and that's sort of what I'm trying to think through. What would it look like to take an interlinked web of sociality as the starting point for the study of religion, for thinking about religion, rather than books or beliefs or something like that? It's just it's a thought, it's an underdeveloped thought, but it seems as though this controversy is one interesting way into it. I'm also interested in libel law as a way into it. There are libel cases all over the place, all of the time, because human beings like to say nasty things about other human beings. But there was certainly a fair share of them in colonial India, and often around religious figures. I worked on this mostly in the context of the Maharaja libel case of 1862 in Bombay, which is this sort of important reformist Hindu event in which an enterprising young journalist writes into his newspaper scurrilous gossip about a prominent local religious leader who then sues him for libel. What is it to take such relations between persons as a starting point for religion, and particularly want to think about religious affect or religious feelings? That's not really an answer except to say that's exactly what I'm thinking about.
Cool. Me too.
Okay, thank you everyone.
Thank you.
And thank you to Bart.